In the early decades of the 19th century, Mexico was a giant on the map but fragile at its core. The revolution that had won its independence from Spain in 1821 had dragged on for over a decade, leaving the country exhausted, chaotic, and leaderless. What should have been a triumphant new beginning instead felt like a house built on sand. Mexico, stretched across more than 4.5 million square kilometers, was vast, proud, and rich in potential, but plagued by infighting, rebellions, and the looming shadow of Spanish troops waiting in nearby Cuba for a chance to return. Across the northern border, a very different story was unfolding. The United States was young, ambitious, and hungry. Its boundaries were already swelling after the Louisiana Purchase, and wave after wave of settlers pressed into Native American lands. The spirit of expansion was in the air, and for a president like James K. Polk, elected in 1844 on promises of re-annexing Texas and pushing the frontier ever westward, Mexico's weakness looked less like a tragedy and more like an opportunity. Texas was the spark. Having declared independence in 1836, it existed in a tense limbo, claimed by Mexico, courted by the U.S., and eyed suspiciously by northern politicians wary of adding another slave state. But when Texas officially joined the Union in December 1845, Mexico seethed. To Polk, it was a chance to push further. He dangled money for California and New Mexico, and when Mexico refused, he played his next card, sending U.S. troops into a disputed strip of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. It was tinder waiting for a match. The match struck on April 25, 1846. Mexican cavalry clashed with American soldiers, killing a dozen. The skirmish was small, but its echo was enormous. Polk declared that American blood had been spilled on American soil, and Congress, stirred to outrage, answered with a declaration of war. The Mexican-American War had begun. The armies that now faced each other could not have been more different. Mexico's soldiers were poorly fed, barely trained, and often forced into service. The United States, though still a rising power, was better organized, better supplied, and led by ambitious generals with eyes on glory. One of them was Zachary Taylor, whose victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma made him a national hero. Another was a hard-driving officer named Winfield Scott, whose campaign would carry the war to Mexico's heart. And in the shadows stood Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the chameleon of Mexican politics, who returned from exile promising to fight for Mexico, but secretly negotiating with the enemy. The war spread like wildfire. In the north, Taylor marched south into Mexico, clashing in the streets of Monterrey and later facing Santa Anna himself at Buena Vista. Outnumbered and nearly broken, Taylor's army held fast with brutal artillery fire, and Santa Anna, battered and haunted by uprisings back home, slipped away. In the west, General Stephen Watts Kearny entered Santa Fe unopposed, claimed New Mexico for the United States, and pressed on toward California. There, Commodore Robert Stockton and the ever-restless John C. Fremont led campaigns that toppled Mexican authority and planted the American flag in the Pacific. But it was Scott's march from Veracruz that would decide the war. In March 1847, under the thunder of cannons and clouds of smoke, he led the first great amphibious landing in U.S. history. Veracruz fell, and the road to Mexico City lay open. Santa Anna tried to block the Americans at Cerro Gordo, but Scott's men flanked the defenses, shattering Mexican resistance. Step by step, battle by battle, the Americans closed in on the capital, Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey, and finally, the storming of Chapultepec Castle. By September, Mexico City was in U.S. hands. The war was effectively over. The cost was immense. For Mexico, it was humiliation and heartbreak. Cities burned, soldiers deserting in droves, a nation's pride cut down in defeat. For the United States, it was triumph, but also a moral reckoning. Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the war as a young lieutenant, would later write that it had been provoked, deliberately staged to grab land and silence opposition. He called it one of the most unjust wars ever fought by a stronger against a weaker nation, and yet the results were undeniable. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, stripped Mexico of half its territory. Texas, California, New Mexico, and vast stretches of the Southwest, all were handed to the United States for a mere $15 million, less than what Polk had once offered. In one stroke, America's map was transformed. The nation had gained over 900,000 square miles of land, its gaze fixed now firmly on the Pacific. Mexico was left smaller, shaken, and wounded. The United States stood taller, more powerful than ever, but with shadows already forming on the horizon. For expansion had come at a price. The new lands would ignite fierce debates over slavery, debates that would one day tear the Union apart in a civil war. The Mexican-American War was more than a border dispute. It was a collision of ambition and fragility, of a rising power and a struggling neighbor. It was the story of battles fought in deserts and mountains, of generals chasing glory, and of ordinary soldiers dying far from home. And it was a turning point that reshaped not only two nations but the entire destiny of a continent.